In August of 1971, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Reinhardt paid $40 for the grazing rights to 460 acres of harvested wheat stubble that the selling family considered so thoroughly worthless they had almost left it off the auction sheet entirely. Not the land, just the right to graze it. For one season. The auctioneer, a man named Dale Sutter, who had been calling sales in Grundy County for 19 years, listed it the way a man lists something he is slightly embarrassed to be listing. He said the parcel had been combined in late July, that the straw had been baled and removed, and that what remained was approximately 4 inches of cut stem, a fair amount of volunteer weed pressure, and soil that had been tilled and cropped continuously since 1947. He said grazing rights would transfer for one season only, August through October, and that the buyer would be responsible for fencing, water, and any damage to adjacent fields. He said he would open bidding at $20 and see what happened. A scrap dealer from Ackley bid $20. Nora Reinhardt bid $40. The scrap dealer looked at her, decided she was confused about what was being sold, and sat down. Her brother-in-law, Harold Reinhardt, was standing beside her. He said, "Nora, that's harvested wheat ground. There's nothing there." She said she knew. He said $40 was $40. She said she knew that too. Harold looked at the field in question, which was flat and pale, and gave no indication of being worth $40 or $4, and decided the conversation was finished. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties, from the liquidation sale to the co-op in town, from the co-op to the Grundy Center diner on G Avenue, from the diner to the parking lot of the Methodist Church on Sunday morning. By the time it reached the church, it had accumulated details that were not strictly accurate. Some versions had Nora paying $80. None of them were right, but all of them agreed on the essential point, which was that Nora Reinhardt had paid good money for a field of cut wheat stems in August, and that this was the funniest thing that had happened in Grundy County in recent memory. They laughed for 2 seasons. They stopped laughing in 1977 when the topsoil started moving. Let me tell you about Nora Reinhardt. Because what she did with that wheat stubble and what she built from it over the following decade only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she had already decided about the land before she ever set foot in that liquidation sale. Donna Elaine Reinhardt was born in 1940 on a farm 3 miles northeast of Grundy Center, the second of 4 children belonging to Walter and Edna Pfeiffer. Walter Pfeiffer farmed 220 acres of ground that his own father had broken in 1904, and he farmed it the way his father had farmed it, which is to say, carefully, suspiciously, and with a deep and abiding distrust of anyone who wanted to lend him money. He had a saying he used so often, his children could finish it before he did. He said a payment is just a debt wearing a hat. He said it about tractors, about seed loans, about the new combine the co-op wanted to finance for him in 1958. He said it, and then he went back to farming with what he had. What Walter Pfeiffer had, beyond the land and the equipment, was a particular way of seeing soil. He had grown up watching his father fight the ground, watching him plow and disc and cultivate and plow again. And somewhere in that watching, he had developed a skepticism about tillage that was not fashionable in Grundy County in the 1940 seconds. He did not have a name for what he believed. He did not read university bulletins or attend extension meetings. He had simply noticed, over 40 years of farming the same ground, that the years when the soil stayed covered were the years the soil stayed put, and the years when the soil was bare and black and worked to a fine tilth. He taught this to Nora, not through lectures, but through the specific and unhurried method of showing her things and asking her what she saw. He would walk her to the fence line, where the native grass had never been broken, and show her the soil there, dark and crumbled, and held together by roots that went down 6 and 8 feet. And then he would walk her to the plowed field, 20 yards away, and show her the difference. He never told her what to conclude. He waited for her to conclude it herself. Nora concluded it by the time she was 12. She never unconvinced herself. She married Harold Reinhardt's younger brother, Carl, in 1963. Carl Reinhardt was a decent man and a competent farmer who had inherited his family's 310 acres free and clear, which was the quality Nora had found most attractive about him. Not because she was calculating, but because she understood that debt-free land was the only land that actually belonged. They farmed together for 6 years. Carl died of a heart attack in the spring of 1969, at the age of 34, while he was greasing the planter bearings in the machine shed. He was dead before the ambulance reached the farm. Nora was 29 years old. She had 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. She had 310 acres of paid-for land, a savings account with $11,000 in it, a set of equipment that was old but owned outright, and her father's way of seeing soil Harold Reinhardt told her she should sell. He said 310 acres was too much for a woman alone with 2 small children. He said the land would bring good money and she could move into town and do something sensible. Nora thanked him for his concern and told him she would be fine. Harold looked at her the way men look at women who have just said something they believe is false, and drove home. She was fine. She was considerably more than fine. Now the wheat stubble. When Nora Reinhardt looked at 460 acres of cut wheat stems in August of 1971, she did not see what the rest of Grundy County saw. The rest of Grundy County saw a harvested field with nothing left in it. A depleted thing, a field that had given what it had to give and was now waiting to be plowed and planted again. Here is what she knew that Grundy County didn't, or rather what she knew that Grundy County had decided not to think about. Wheat stubble in August is not a depleted field. It is a field covered by root mass that goes down 18 inches and by surface residue that holds moisture and feeds biology and protects the top 2 inches of soil, which are the only 2 inches that matter from the wind. A plowed wheat field in August is a different thing entirely. It is bare. It is loose. It is in the language Nora's father had used without ever using those words exactly. What Nora had also known since the previous spring was that she had cattle. Let me tell you about the cattle, because this is where the story stops being about wheat stubble and starts being about something. In March of 1971, 5 months before the liquidation sale, Nora Reinhardt had purchased 43 mixed stockers at a sale barn in Marshalltown for an average of $61 a head. She had trucked them home and put them on her own ground, which was in corn the previous year and would be in soybeans the following spring, and she had grazed them on the cover crop she had seeded into the corn stubble in September. The cover crop was a mixture of cereal, rye, and hairy vetch, which she had put in at her own expense and which her neighbors had observed with the polite bafflement that Grundy County reserved for farming practices it did not recognize. The cattle were eating, and by July it was clear to Nora that she had more cattle than she had ground to graze through August and September, which was the period between when her cover crop would be grazed out and when she could move the cattle to winter ground. She needed forage, she needed it cheap, and she needed it in a form that would not require her to own more land than she already owned. She had been watching the Hendersons' farm since April, when it became clear the family was going to liquidate. She knew the wheat field. She had driven past it 100 times. She had stopped and walked it once in May, before the wheat headed out, and she had knelt in the row middles and looked at the soil and the root mass and the residue from the previous crop, and she had done arithmetic in her head that came out to a number she liked. The Henderson wheat field would carry her 43 cattle from mid-August through mid-October if she managed the grazing correctly. Managed it correctly meant something specific. It meant she would not turn all 43 cattle into 460 acres and let them graze it down to bare dirt. It meant she would move the cattle through it in concentrated groups, letting each section rest before the cattle returned, keeping the root mass intact and the residue on the soil surface and the biology in the top 2 inches alive and working. She had learned the principle from her father, who had never called it anything. She had read about it in a 1968 bulletin. The bulletin called it rotational grazing. The bulletin said it preserved soil structure and maintained ground cover and improved water infiltration. That is what my father was seeing at the fence line. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman pay $40 for a field of cut stems. They were watching her execute a grazing plan she had been building since March. She fenced the Henderson field herself in August in the heat, with her son helping carry posts. She used temporary electric fence, which she moved every 4 days, dividing the 460 acres into 12 paddocks of roughly 38 acres each. She moved them on August 18th. She moved them again on August 22nd. The cattle ate the wheat stems and the volunteer growth and the weed mass, and their hooves pressed the residue into the soil surface, and their manure went into the ground, and the paddocks behind them rested and the root mass held, and the soil did not move. Harold Reinhardt drove out in the 3rd week of August. He stood at the fence and watched the cattle for a while, and then he walked the paddock they had just vacated, and he came back and stood at the fence again. He said, "What are they eating?" Nora said stems, volunteers, some pigweed, some lamb's quarters. Harold said, and they're gaining on that. Nora said the last time she weighed them, they were gaining 1.5 pounds a day. Harold looked at the cattle, and then at the ground, and then at Nora, and he didn't say anything else. He drove home. The cost of the operation. When Nora tallied it in her ledger, that October was this: grazing rights, $40. Temporary fence post and wire, $63. Labor, her own and her son's, $0 in cash. Hauling cattle to and from the Henderson field, $12 in fuel. Total, $115 for 2 months of forage for 43 cattle. She had saved, against buying hay or renting improved pasture, somewhere between $400 and $600. The cattle went to market in November at an average gain of 91 pounds per head. She cleared enough to pay her property taxes, her seed bill for the following spring, and put $1,800 into savings. She did this without borrowing $1 and without selling an acre. That winter she sat at the kitchen table with her father's soil maps, which Walter Pfeiffer had drawn by hand on graph paper in the 1,950 seconds, mapping every field on his farm by texture and drainage and erosion potential. She had her own maps now, maps of her 310 acres and the neighboring ground she had come to know over years of watching it. She looked at the maps and she looked at her ledger, and she made a decision that she did not announce to anyone. She was going to build a grazing system. Permanent infrastructure, managed rotation, cover crops between cash crops, cattle as the engine that moved fertility around the farm. She was going to do it on her own ground first, and she was going to do it without debt, and she was going to do it the way her father had done everything, which was carefully and over a long time and without asking anyone's permission. Over the next 4 years, she spent money in a sequence that looked to anyone watching like a series of small and unrelated purchases. She bought permanent fence posts in 1972, 400 of them, from a farm sale in Tama County for $80. She bought a used water tank in 1973 for $35 and plumbed it herself with pipe she salvaged from a demolished hog building. She seeded her first permanent pasture in 1973, 12 acres of orchard grass and red clover on ground that had been in continuous row crop since Carl was alive, and she did it with a drill she borrowed from her father's farm. She bought 3 more cows in 1974 and built her herd by keeping the best heifers rather than selling them. She bought a second-hand electric fence charger in 1974 for $22. She spent $40 on grass seed in 1975 and seeded another 18 acres. Total infrastructure investment. The Grundy County farmers who were watching her, and some of them were watching her, did not see a system being built. They saw a widow buying fence posts and grass seed. They saw a woman who was, in the charitable interpretation, keeping herself busy, and in the less charitable interpretation, slowly converting productive cropland to something that would not pencil out. What they were actually watching was a farm being restructured from the ground up, one paddock at a time, with no debt and no timeline except the one Nora had set for herself. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone who was simply operating on a longer timeline than anyone around them, stick with me. Because what happened in Grundy County between 1976 and 1983 is the part of this story that makes everything before it makes sense. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 6 years, because this is where the story stops being about cattle and wheat stubble and starts being about soil. You know what happened in the middle years of the 1,970 seconds in Iowa. You know about the commodity boom, about the export markets opening, about Earl Booz and his instruction to plant fence row. You know about the land values that climbed so fast that farmers who had been cautious their whole lives started believing that the numbers on the banker's appraisal were real and permanent. You know about the loans. You know about what happened when the loans came due. In Grundy County, the pressure to plant every available acre was not abstract. It was present at the co-op and at the elevator and at the bank. Farmers who had kept their fence lines and their waterways and their small patches of permanent grass started looking at those acres and doing arithmetic. The arithmetic said corn at $3 a bushel, land at $2,000 an acre, borrowed money at 8%, pencils out the fence lines came out. The permanent grass was broken and put to corn. Nora Reinhardt watched this happen on the farms around her. She watched it without satisfaction and without alarm. By 1976, she had 61 cattle, 4 permanent paddocks on her own ground, totaling 48 acres, cover crops on every field that came out of soybeans, and a savings account that had grown to $44,000. She had not borrowed money since Carl died. She had not needed to. Her cash costs per cow per year were low enough that she could write the number on a napkin and hand it to any banker in Grundy County, and they would not believe it was real. The drought came in the summer of 1976. It was not the worst drought Iowa had seen, but it was bad enough, and it hit the tilled ground hardest. Fields that had been worked to a fine seed bed in April and planted in May had nothing holding the surface together by July. The topsoil was loose and dry, and when the wind came in August, it moved. It moved in the way that topsoil moves when there is nothing to stop it, which is to say, it moved in sheets and clouds, and it moved from fields that had been producing crops for 30 years, and it did not come back. Nora's ground did not move. The paddocks held. The cover crops on the row crop fields held. The permanent grass held. She lost some yield on her corn acres, the same as everyone else, but she lost no soil, and in September, when she walked her fields, she could see the difference between her fence lines and her neighbor's fence lines as clearly as her father had shown her at the fence line on the Pfeiffer farm 30 years before. The drought of 1976 was a warning. Grundy County heard it as a bad year and moved on. The crisis that actually stopped the laughter was not a drought. It was a combination of things that arrived together in 1980 and 1981 and did not leave until they had taken a significant portion of what Grundy County had built during the boom years. Interest rates climbed to 18%. Commodity prices fell. Land values, which had been the collateral for the loans that had financed the fence line removal and the waterway tiling and the expansion, dropped by 30 and 40% in 3 years. Farmers who had borrowed at 8% to buy land, at $2,000 an acre, found themselves paying 18% on land that was now worth $1,100 an acre. The farms started going, not all at once. First, the ones that had stretched farthest, then the ones that had stretched only a little. Harold Reinhardt, who had borrowed in 1978 to add 160 acres to his operation, sold that ground in 1982 at a loss that took him 4 years to recover from. The Hendersons, whose wheat field Nora had grazed in 1971, had sold their entire operation in 1979 at the top of the market and moved to Arizona, which turned out to be the luckiest thing they ever did. The Meyer family, 3 miles to Nora's north, lost their farm in a foreclosure proceeding in the spring of 1983. They had farmed that ground for 41 years. Nora watched this with quiet sadness. These were people she had known her whole life. Their losses were real losses. She had no pleasure in being right. Her expenses did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She did not have an interest payment. She did not have an equipment loan. She did not have a land payment. Her cash costs were her seed, her fuel, her fence maintenance, her vet bills, and the small accumulations of a farm that runs on what it generates rather than what it borrows. When corn dropped to $2.50 a bushel, her margin compressed but did not disappear because she had no fixed debt service eating the margin from below. By 1982, her savings account held $91,000. The Meyer farm went to auction in March of 1983. It was 240 acres of ground that Nora had watched for 12 years, ground she had evaluated the way her father had taught her to evaluate ground, by walking it and reading it and understanding what it had been asked to do and what it had given up in the asking. The Meyer ground had been tilled hard through the boom years. It had lost topsoil in 1976 and again in 1980. It was not ruined ground, but it was tired ground. And Nora knew that tired ground, with the right management, could be rebuilt. And she knew what management she would apply to it, and she had done the arithmetic on the napkin. She drove to the auction on a Tuesday morning in March. It was cold, and the ground was still frozen. There were 11 people bidding, including 2 men from a land investment company out of Des Moines who had been attending farm auctions across central Iowa for 2 years, buying distressed ground at reduced prices and holding it for the recovery. The bidding opened at $400 an acre. It moved in increments. The investment company men bid methodically, the way men bid when they are spending other people's money according to a spreadsheet. Nora bid once when the price reached $650 an acre. She bid again at $750. The investment company men looked at each other at $750 an acre, and one of them shook his head and the other one put his paddle down. The auctioneer looked at Nora. She nodded. 240 acres at $750 an acre. $180,000. She wrote a check. The crowd at that auction was not large. There were perhaps 30 people standing in the cold in the Meyer farmyard. But the 30 people who were there went quiet in a way that it was the quiet of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about Nora Reinhardt and arriving simultaneously at a new arrangement. It was the quiet of a county realizing it had been watching something for 12 years and had not understood what it was watching. He had come because he always came to auctions, the way farmers come to auctions, even when they are not buying, because auctions are where you learn what things are worth. He watched Nora write the check, and he stood there for a moment after the crowd began to move. And then he walked over to her, and he stood beside her, and he said, "Your father would have understood this." Nora said she knew. Harold said he wished he had understood it sooner. Nora said most people did. That was all. She folded her copy of the purchase agreement and put it in her coat pocket and walked to her truck. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Walter Pfeiffer would have understood without a word of explanation. To Nora Reinhardt farmed the combined 550 acres, her original 310, and the Meyer ground for the next 19 years. She rebuilt the Meyer topsoil the way she had been told it could be rebuilt, slowly and through the consistent application of cover and root mass and cattle manure and thyme. By 1990, the Meyer ground was producing yields within 5% of her original ground. By 1995, it was producing the same yields. The soil tests told the story in numbers. Organic matter up from 1.8% to 3.1% in 12 years. Water infiltration improved. Erosion near zero. She turned the operation over to her daughter Karen in 2001. Karen had grown up on the farm and had been running the cattle operation since she was 16. She had learned to read soil at the fence line the way Nora had learned it, by being shown things and being asked what she saw. And she had concluded the same things Nora had concluded, and she had never unconvinced herself either. Walter Pfeiffer's soil maps were still in the farm office. The originals in a manila folder, Karen's updated versions on the desk beside them. The electric fence charger Nora had bought for $22 in 1974 had been replaced twice. But the posts from the 1972 farm sale were still in the ground in the east paddock, still holding wire, still doing what fence posts do when they are set correctly and left alone. In 2003, at a soil health meeting at the Grundy County Extension Office, Nora was asked to speak. She was 63 years old. She stood at the front of a room with 40 farmers in it, and she said what she had been demonstrating for 30 years without saying. She said, "I want to ask you something. When you look at a harvested wheat field in August, What do you see? Most of you see a field that's done. You see stems and dirt and something waiting to be plowed. I see a root system. I see 2 inches of topsoil that somebody spent 100 years building. I see forage for cattle that doesn't cost what hay costs. I see biology that's still alive if you don't kill it. She paused. She said, the difference between what you see and what I see is about $40 and 30 years. A man in the third row, a farmer named Dennis Schrock, whose father had been at the 1971 liquidation sale and had laughed about the $40 wheat stubble at the co-op, raised his hand. He said, "How do you start?" Nora said, "You start by not plowing the field you just harvested. You start by asking what's already there before you decide it's worth nothing." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when something plain has been said that everyone in the room has been circling around for years without saying. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a field of cut wheat stems in August? Most people see a field that's finished. Nora Reinhardt saw a root system, a forage source, a soil cover, and the beginning of a 30-year argument. She was going to win without raising her voice. $40. A harvested field. A woman who had learned to read soil at a fence line in Grundy County, Iowa, before she was old enough to drive. The wheat stubble nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the topsoil blew and her ground was the only ground in the county that stayed where it belonged.